welcome. Nice young audience. You're all young enough to be my grandchildren. So I feel really, I probably should be upstairs in the library actually with the launch of Alan Cahoon's, or book Cahoonery, I think it's called. So maybe I feel a bit out of order here. And anyway, Cahoon, of course, was represented everything that I was against, and probably Theo is against as well, in spite of his wonderful intellect. So I'm sure this is the hardest introduction I've ever done, actually, because really they need, particularly to an audience like yourselves, Minimaforms need no introduction. They were, as you know, I won't go through all the details. They're available in the book, which is available for sale later on. They were formed in 2002, and a working brother relationship, which is quite unusual, I suppose, in the scheme of things. And they work in a realm which repeatedly is called experimental architecture. Personally, I really dislike the phrase experimental architecture. They don't talk about experimental sculpture or painting, and I prefer the phrase that Rosalind Krauss uses, which is architecture in the expanded field. I have loads of notes. I was going to write them a letter and read you the letter, a sort of love letter, if you like. But in an effort to find something more about them than I already knew, I did some Googling in a rather amateurish way. I know some really good Googlers. Personally, I don't quite cut it in that way. And the first site I found used this awful frame, experimental architecture, and a design studio that provokes new means of communications. However, I can't show you it really. I've got it somewhere here. It says here. I don't know whether you can see this. It says minimaforms.com, 4 ways to avoid running out of money during retirement, and tax return company, professional tax return experts. Now I can only assume, I often mostly meet Theo in the corridor. I'm sorry, this is going to be a real ramble, so you're going to have to put up with it, I'm afraid. And so this is the first lesson you can learn from Minimaforms, that provoking an experiment may not pay the rent. So if you're coming to the AA to experiment, you need to know that right from the beginning. So anyway, if that's the first lesson, I'll throw this away. I'm not very good at this, really. I don't know why they asked me. Anyway, so I then went to Wikipedia, and the first thing that Wikipedia says is that Minimaforms does not exist. But it further goes on to say you could ask for it to be created. Now, I think that's quite, I was quite pleased by that. I thought, that's quite Minimaforms. They like because the implicit text, that's a good intellectual word, isn't it? Text. The implicit text behind, subtext behind Minimaforms is about absence and erasure. So I have to go back to a quote that I put in their book from Robert Barry, where he said in 1968, "The world is full of objects, more or less interesting, and I don't wish to add any more." And it sort of reminded me in a way of projects like Memory Cloud, which is definitely about getting rid of objects. So Zaha, Frank, Minimaforms are on your case. So, but I then went to Memory Cloud on the internet, of which it says ideas must find other forms in a kind of hybrid architecture. Lots of prototyping, lots of patience, so that's another message for young students. It takes a while, it doesn't come fast. And then I try another project, which is Petting View. And I really enjoyed this one. Sorry, Theo. Because the London Borough of Camden, if I can find, here we are. You probably can't see this. This says Petting Zoo at the Camden Arts Centre. Now I know this has got nothing to do with Theo, because Petting Zoo was a project which I saw at the Barbican. It was probably the nicest thing there, I thought. And Minimaforms share an interest with Camden, obviously, in petting. I'm not sure whether this is heavy petting or light petting. But anyway, Camden invited you, I'm going to have to read this, I'm afraid, from my letter to them. Camden invite you to stroke a pig or a goat. However, it is not at all clear whether both Camden and Miniforms claim although they claim a kind of engagement with their pets, whether they are robots or not. And I know that at FRAC, where I think, as far as I can judge, that petting zoo was at FRAC, but with real animals. So the robot animal and the real animal coexisted in the same exhibition. It's a kind of collision, if that is the right word, that explicitly engages what is now to be has to be the big question. And it is the future of artificial intelligence. And we now know that even Stephen Hawking is sort of, he says he's worried about it. I don't know why he's worried, but he says he is. But I don't know whether you're going to talk about this, but I guess that's probably the next stage. And if Minimaforms has another version of Petting Zoo, that it engages new developments in artificial intelligence. But I have to say, apart from that, there are things which you can't, I know I'm rambling, I'm sorry, because I have a lot of affection for this group, so you have to put up with it again, that there's a lot of stuff you can't find out about them by Googling or through algorithms, and the word that comes to mind is generosity, that they have an immense, Stephen, I'm sorry, I don't know you so well, but certainly from Theo, an immense generosity in terms of time, the time given to students, the time to exchange ideas, the time to exchange information. And that generosity, I think, is a really important part of their contribution, which is quite unusual, really, because we live in a really competitive environment, not only in terms of money and all of that stuff, but in terms of ideas, people shielding their ideas. But it's only through sharing this stuff and being generous with it that we can kind of go forward as a community, living in what none of you've read this book, I know, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, the Bible for my generation, where living at the front of the train is the point at which the past and the present collide with the future. And of course, that's a really rough place to be, dangerous place. It's turbulent, it's unsteady, but hopefully we can join Minimaforms in living in that unsteady, unpredictable location. So we welcome the familiar figure of Theo, the less familiar Theo of his brother Stephen, and I know we're going to learn a lot. Okay, thank you.
I think, for me anyway, I think it was probably one of the more humbling moments when I got an email and a conversation with Manaji, when I had people like Ryan suggest to David to do the introduction, and then I heard that David was going to do it. Because I've known David for many years, and he was someone from the very beginning who, at the same time, would give us an opportunity, was the same person that basically said, really be careful, this might be shit. You may get caught up with your techniques and all this fancy stuff. Are you capable of basically saying no to architecture just as much as you are to sort of exploring ideas with things? And I think for many, many years, I think he's probably been the colleague that I feel like I've shared a lot without having to say many words. And when he asked us to revisit some of his projects to see if a lot of that stuff still resonated today, it has sort of, I think I could say for Stephen and me, kind of challenged us and preoccupied us to think about things and the continuation and an evolution of a lot of ideas that I think we share. And sometimes maybe we are somehow slightly nostalgic about certain things of the past, but at the same time we feel we have much more in common with some of those ideas of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. For me personally, I've made this place my home for 13 years, and I came here as a student, and my brother came shortly after to study in Central St. Martin's. Stephen is an interaction designer and an artist, and I came, I guess, as an architect here. And I think for a lot of the things that we've done, we've sort of co-evolved with this place, and in some ways, I think this is technically the second time that I'm speaking about the work and the second time that I have the chance and the privilege to speak with my brother. So we titled the talk All is Architecture, in memory of Hans Hollein, who passed away, but in the same time, we've lost, I think, a lot of people that were really provocateurs and challenging, I think, the architectural discourse. Fry Otto most recently, Dr. Ranulph Glanville, who was my PhD supervisor. The list kind of goes on and on, from Lebbeus Woods and others. So I think what resonated a lot with me was this 3-word little statement called all is architecture. If I think about the version of what me and my brother would call all is interaction, I think a lot of the things that we've tried to do is very much about exploring ideas and pursuits to find ways of thinking about communication between things. And when we gave a talk 5 years, I think, to this month ago, it was the first time that we had a publication that Brett gave us a chance to put together. And it was the first moment that we actually had some reflection about the stuff that we were doing. And we titled it Enabling, I think a term that Cedric Price used to use quite often, and people like John and others. And it felt like the most appropriate, because for many things that me and Stephen are kind of exploring, communication and interaction is really at the heart of it. So what we've tried to do is to put together a little bit of an overview of some of the things that influenced us and some of the things that challenge us, and I think some of the things that we've tried to put forward as projects into the world. And at the heart of all of that, we have some statements that we feel resonate very much today as they did back when we first started to conceptualize what we were trying to do. So communication for us is the enabling agency at the heart of all forms of interaction. And the project that David talked about, Petting Zoos, it is one of the latest projects that we're doing. But at the heart of everything that we're trying to do is try to see how we can facilitate communication between people as much as between things, machines. So if it's between man and man or machine and machine, we're trying to explore things in a way that tries to explore ideas of curiosity and play. We use a lot of technology and all of these other kinds of things, but we don't foreground it because we don't feel it's very important. For us, technology is really a very human pursuit, and we're usually asked quite a lot about how robots are going to take over the world and all of these other kinds of things that people have burdened preoccupations with. But the reality of things is technologies are existing and they're in the world, and they are really no going back. So for us, it's really about trying to make things accessible and make them shared, and to try to explore things in a more playful and curious manner. We've had different opportunities to develop strategies to put things in the world, and a lot of them, for Stephen and me, were about really fostering participation. I think when we came here, one of the opportunities that we had was really about trying to explore ideas that were shared and collective, and to create environments that were more behavioral and allowing people, and generally the general public, non-architects, non-artists, to really participate and engage things. And we felt that it was an important thing as designers and architects to be motivated with that pursuit. So for us, the role of design today is collective and it's shared, and it's one of action and awareness. We pursue participatory models as a means to challenge prescriptive models of command and control. And I think as we started Minimaforms, we probably weren't very aware of a lot of the things that we were doing. I think in some way we were taking whatever opportunities we had as a way to challenge ourselves and to explore ideas. I think for much of it, it was really about trying to create an understanding and to try to find a sensibility about how we could explore design and how can design really engage people in different ways. And at the same time, I think in parallel to working together, I also started teaching in this place. And in the design research lab, which I've been a part of now for 13 years, I came originally as a student and left, and I worked with people like Peter Eisenman and came back. And when I came back with Stephen, we launched Minimaforms at the same time as I started my teaching career here. And for me, a lot of the issues around computation and moving beyond form and exploring notions of the machine were something that were very important to us. And in parallel, talking with Stephen, who's coming from a very different perspective, which was very useful to me in particular, was to sort of question actually what architecture really was. And we came with a definition that architecture for us was space, and the medium that we were going to explore was time. In doing so, we found a lot of, I think, kinship with a lot of those early experiments. I think things that John would say about people computing without computers, people like Nicholas Negroponte starting the architecture machine group and actually evolving a series of novel ideas that would become formalized and would change the way that we think about things, like the AMG turning into things like the MIT Media Lab. We were really interested also in people that were trying to create machines that would allow other people to learn, facility through interaction, like the work of Seymour Papert and others. People like Negroponte and these kind of projects where they were creating a kind of ecology of interfacing, where space was defined by a vitrine, a machine, a series of gerbils, and the kind of protocol that basically was just allowing these things to play out over time. I think a lot of the things that we try to explore try to really take an understanding that there are things that are latent and there are things that are unknown. So one way or one approach towards design is to really allow these things to actually have a meaningful influence. And some of the words that were kind of outlined in some of those early experiments, I still think resonate quite a lot today. So if it's Negroponte in this instance, where he says that he should treat the problem as an intimate association of two dissimilar species, man and machine, two dissimilar processes, design and computation, and two intelligent systems, the architect and the architecture machine. I think a lot of the things that people were trying to wrestle through and to speculate through thought experiments really became a big influence for me and for Stephen, and particularly because we were coming to London, I think very much influenced by artists like Robert Morris and Robert Rauschenberg, and coming much more from art and a conceptual art kind of background. We found figures like Gordon Pask and Walter Gray Walter and others like Edward Ignatowicz developing structures and machines that were actually really trying to develop a kind of more human way of engaging things. And at the same time as we were exploring these things, we were also exploring histories of other architects that were creating things in the everyday that really resonated very much with some of the thoughts that we actually had. The metabolists in Japan, for example. And I think a large part of the way that we thought about things was about not only a collective in terms of design between ourselves and our colleagues that would work with us, but also in terms of an educational framework, a way of actually not really trying to create any artificial boundaries in the kinds of ways that we would explore ideas and also share them with our students and with others. And I think that there was a legacy and continues to be a legacy of this in this place. And I quite like this image of John and Cedric and Gordon Pask talking with students, but at the same time, you can imagine those conversations evolving into projects like the Fun Palace and others. For me, like I mentioned before, David has been one of those people where the conversation has been very much a conversation that's continuing, and I hope that continues for a good duration of time. But some of our other heroes and stuff like that are people like Frank Lloyd Wright or Alexander Graham Bell. We really find a lot of interest in people like the Eames, and particularly because they took a kind of aspect of play into the studio environment, and in a certain sense didn't come to projects with a preconceived idea about things. We wanted to challenge ourselves and the habit that we may have. And we obviously worked with quite modest means, and we still do today, if I'm very honest. But I thought always that they tried to find a creative way of actually trying to explore these things, like even a simple boom attached to a truck would allow them to develop movies like Powers of 10, which went from the most minuscule to the most galactical. And when we started to explore even further and saw some of our heroes, let's say back home, like Robert Rauschenberg, when we came here from New Jersey, was also participating in things like experiments for art and technology and kind of giving over into these kind of hybrids, where it's not architecture, it's not art, it's not tech, but it was a collective that came together to explore certain things. We felt that there was something that resonated quite deeply with ours. And the aspects of architecture or computation or systemic design, I think for many ways is being articulated in different forms. But we talk, I think, about the way that we approach systems much more from a behavioral kind of approach. And I think it outlines some of the research that I do here with my students most recently. Things like Walter Gray Walter's tortoises, which were some of the first embodied intelligent agent systems. And I quite like this image because it's not a foreign object, it's almost like a pet in the everyday environment. And Walter Gray Walter was trying to explore ideas of basically communicating how the brain works and make that accessible and to share that in different ways. And there were other cybernetic projects like the Homeostat that was also talking about systems that were self-regulatory. And these started to actually inform us of some of these kind of maverick experiments that could happen. People like Claude Shannon, who was a seminal figure in information theory, also had some very particular things that he was interested in. One of it was juggling, and the other one was in maze-solving mechanical systems, like these mechanical mice that would find their wayfinding through different kinds of labyrinths that was being created. There were also people like John Conway, who was doing the game of life,
consists of a grid,
which we felt was really interesting.
Extending infinitely in all
This
directions.
is the explanation to Game of Life.
Each square of the grid can either be lit up, which he called alive, or dark, which he called dead. Whether a given square is dead or alive depends on what is happening in the 8 other squares that surround it. For example, if a living square like this one has no living squares nearby, the rules say it will die of loneliness. If a living square is surrounded by more than 3 other living squares, the square will also die of overcrowding. But if a dead square is surrounded by 3 living squares, it becomes lit, or is born. Once you set an initial state of living squares and let the simulation run, these simple laws determine what happens in the future. The results are surprising. As the program progresses, shapes appear and disappear spontaneously. Collections of shapes move across the grid, bouncing off one another. There are whole kinds of objects, species, that interact. Some can even reproduce.
So for us, what was interesting also, even people that were looking at things from pure mathematical approaches, like Conway, would discuss these problems like the game of life and the lifelike characteristics of some of these things. And when he was asked about mathematics recently, he said that mathematics was easy, but cats were very complex. And I think the challenges of actually trying to explore models that are beyond, I think, the calculated is something that's very important to us. Other references that are very important are people like Carl Sims, who was discussing ways of evolving creatures and developing body plans that didn't have a holistic understanding of themselves, but over time would learn and try to evolve. And these kind of experiments, I think, play a big role of the way that we see some of these things. If we look at today, anyway, we have a lot of these kind of ideas being basically enacted.
This team will never believe this.
Oh my goodness. Go is the right word. Holy shit. Holy shit. There's no fucking hands on that wheel. Oh my god. What?
It's driving itself.
Ah! Ah!
So for example, when we talk about machines today in the everyday, that was an example of Google's first kind of trial runs of the autonomous vehicle. But when we start to explore issues about the machine today, we start to talk about a very different kind of attitude towards the machine. If cybernetics had a certain kind of attitude towards control, second order cybernetics brought in the role of the observer, and now we have, I think, a more complex kind of scenario where we're going to have a whole series of interacting machines. For example, Rolls-Royce's drones for freight, or Amazon's kind of attitude towards delivery. Thinking about machines not as machines anymore, but actually as lifelike agents in our everyday. So for example, these are two examples. One on the left is the Roomba's version of your Hoover or vacuum cleaner that will come out and basically hoover around your environment, your everyday, while you actually go off to work. On the right, a knockoff version doing the same thing. One capacity of machines also have the version of learning and exploring. We also develop a kind of strategy which is looking at a very different synthesis of information. So things like autonomous vehicles are happening simultaneously in the immediate, in a much more bottom-up and kind of reactive strategy, and at the same time surveilled with a much more global network. And so we start to see that information right now is something that is enabling a very different kind of relationship to population and to machine. And within a lot of the research that we do with our students, we try to explore these kind of things, because at some moment, even if we think we understand them, as we're sort of developing these systems, they start to open up, I think, a very different and curious world. And one of them is actually about just facilitating the way that we know things. But I think for us, much more fundamentally, is about exploring the lifelike characteristics and the human tendencies that people have in terms of trying to develop a situation where these machines are not necessarily production-oriented, but they're really embedded in our everyday systems and cycles of life. And the students, I think, work on a whole series of different problems and challenges beyond the machine. They take on board, I think, some aspects which we feel resonate quite a lot with some of the ideas that we have, where some of these robots become aspects of rethinking parking and machines that are shared and collective. And in the DRL, anyway, they turn into creatures of their own right, developing scenarios that are mobile and transformative. And I think a lot of these ideas, I think, resonate with us and in the conversations that we have quite a lot. And we find a very interesting kind of process, which is, I think, maybe much more hyper-accelerated, let's say, in the studio environment and in the work that Steve and I do. As David kind of mentioned, we're quite slow and deliberate. But part of that is because we really feel that there's a human agent element into things that we're really trying to explore. So beyond the machine as a facility or a machine that has a certain autonomy, I think there's a conversation that we'd like to have, which is about participation and thinking about these deeper ecologies of man and machine. But we show these, I think, because very much a part of a lot of the ideas, I think, are very much taken on board also with some of our students, and they sort of push it into domains that also challenge us to reconsider certain things. So what we think about challenging the fixed and the finite takes on different legibility when you start to see how other people also interpret what large populations of structures that could actually be self-built and self-aware starts to transform. And so these kind of conversations will explain a little bit some of the things and some of the recent work, but a lot of these ideas are things that we feel quite comfortable and at home kind of exploring together and part of the larger community. When it comes to Minimaforms, I think one of the things that we have is we don't really believe in disciplinary distinctions. If it's an interface, if it's a vehicle, or if it's a master plan. All of the projects for us are spatial problems, and because they are spatial problems, they are in the domain of architecture and design. And the kinds of things that we've been asked to explore and to discuss, I mean, we're known for some installations, but at the same time being requested to develop strategies for, let's say, Athens' first national park from Renzo Piano, to working in the city of Detroit, where Stephen is going to talk about one of our projects there, to also developing strategies for quite remote areas outside of Norway, well, in Norway and Jolster, right outside of one of the moraine parks. So a lot of the things that we're kind of exploring is always trying to find ways where time and organization is something that evolves. And so beyond simulation, that we can find sort of models that develop strategies that would allow organizations to be something that is potentially more emergent, or at least has the capacity to be more context aware. And some of the projects that we develop are collaborations with other artists or architects. This one in particular, which has been very meaningful to me, is working with an artist named Krzysztof Wodiczko, who has a very strong social and political kind of agenda tied to projection art, but also tied to the concept of vehicles, which we were developing a war veterans vehicle together as a think weapon. And so if it is vehicles, or if it's about sort of developing a strategy for almost taking an architecture in your pocket, like using textiles that could transform and become casted structures, if it's thinking about computation as a way for more pattern-sensitive searches to develop these kind of formational strategies, I think a lot of the things that we do and a lot of the things that we feel quite close to is also having a community of people that feel that this is actually of interest to them to also explore with us. If that is casting tons of plaster and flexible formwork, or if that's working with us to reconsider certain ideas of the machine, we've continuously tried to develop attitudes towards structures and as much towards ephemera as a way of continuing the conversation of how people are actually perceiving and exploring space. We call these things seeing machines, and we develop kind of structures, some architectural, which are maybe more familiar in some way, and some more experimental, like thinking ideas of parks as electric gardens, where instead of just nature in a traditional sense, we have these kind of electric gardens that become fields of exploration for people, and more animalistic kind of strategies towards organization. And with David, the first project that we actually really had an opportunity to work on was in 2003, when he asked us to consider a future vision of London. And this was actually a very interesting problem for us, and actually we'll close the lecture with a project that we showed over the weekend called Emotive City, but it seems to be an ongoing dialogue with this. With David, in a true David fashion, we didn't have any money, but he did have a lot of computers in the University of Westminster, which were, I think, 5 years old, and he asked us if we could do something with. And the way that we sort of recombined these machines and tried to take them apart was part of the learning process, where sometimes we don't always do the smartest stuff, but in some way we build up a certain understanding about the things themselves, demystifying, developing a certain attitude towards the ghost in the machine. And through that, I think we tried to really explore certain human aspects of it. We felt that London was a hybridizing machine. It was a cultural machine. And with my colleague Vasilis at the time, we tried to develop a strategy using portraiture as a way to sort of enable that, as a way to give over some aspects. So this is a capture device that will take your photograph as part of this evolving portrait hybridizing system that we developed. And we had the opportunity to show that here. So I think with that, we'll try to go through maybe 2 or 3 projects in greater detail, but the main one is a project called Memory Cloud that Steve will introduce.
With Theo, we have always had an interest in exploring space as an interface. We wanted to explore space as a medium to facilitate new forms of communication. Early in our time together in London, we were particularly interested in constructing atmospheres. We often explored different mediums that were dynamic and phase-changing. Many of those early experiments challenged us to see how we could consider time and duration as our operative medium. When we had our initial conversations with the ICA in London, our first thoughts were about creating a framework that would allow people to speak to the city and each other. With our interest in atmosphere and communication, we proposed to develop an installation that asked how we could animate the built environment through conversation. Our interest was to explore communication and its spatial implications. We were also never interested to foreground technologies. We found a very interesting correlation between one of the oldest forms of human visual communication, known as smoke signals, and thought that we could hybridize this with contemporary forms of SMS messaging that would allow the general public a personal and intimate interface to communicate through. In conversations with Emma Quinn from the ICA, we discussed what would be the most appropriate place for this kind of intervention. Between Theo and myself, it was clear that Trafalgar Square was the place where this concept should be deployed. The site, which is the most public of civic spaces in London, has historically served the general public to collectively come together for celebrations as well as protests. We believe that Memory Cloud could continue to build on this participatory communication. The project, over the course of a year, was in active dialogue with the Greater London Authority and the neighboring institutions such as the National Portrait Gallery. We were given permission by the GLA and went ahead with installation that was performed over the course of 3 nights in October of 2008. The site of Trafalgar Square was occupied with active observers and conversation to the evolving dialogue. Participants became performers. The installation itself was constructed through atmosphere and shaped through light, which grafted the messages of the public in a dynamic and evolving experience through continually transforming spatial typography. I'll show a short film that documents the piece.
But we will be going over to London for now, where text messages containing greetings, comments, and questions have been projected into clouds of artificial smoke as part of a project in front of London's National Gallery. Memory Cloud was an installation by art and architecture studio Minimaforms.
You're listening to The Robert Helm Show on BBC London 94.9 FM. And the smoke is about to return to London. Don't forget, this is always known as the Big Smoke, because once it was the foggiest, smoggiest city in the world. Well, we've stopped all that now, we're all nice and clean. But not for 3 nights we won't be, because from Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, 8th to the 10th of October, Trafalgar Square will become the Big Smoke again. And it's all because of the Memory Cloud. People go along to Trafalgar Square next week. What are they going to see?
Basically what they're going to see is we're going to try to create an artificial cloud, which is basically going to be content driven by people. We're trying to create an ephemeral structure where people can kind of participate and interact with each other. We were fusing a 5,000-year-old ancient communication, which was visual.
Which one I always assume, from cowboy films, is to do with American Indians or Native
American
Americans.
Indians with carpets and little plumes of smoke. And basically, we're going to graft onto that messages that the public is going to send through text messaging. So we're trying to create a space between kind of very ancient communication and very contemporary communication and allow the people to kind of interact with each other.
So it's a tried and trusted technology. It works.
Technology works, but it's very site-specific. I mean, doing it in Trafalgar Square, I think, is very particular. The context gets animated. Trafalgar Squares are quite public.
Very big. It's a big,
public.
large public space, yeah.
It's a public space, but it's also a space where people really have a voice, and it's a very open space where both tourists and people here actually express themselves. So we're trying to take that on board as part of the artistic platform, where they are actually they're the artists, really.
A project like Memory Cloud redefines conventions of context. In London, the conversations were varied and ranged from novelty to personal sentiments of loved ones in battle. The sentiments were generally of personal nature. For example, 7 wedding proposals took place on the last day of the installation. In our last version of Memory Cloud that took place in 2010 in the city of Detroit, an opportunity to create a platform arose through the initiative of the Detroit Institute of Arts to create a framework for the public to express themselves and bring together the communities that call Detroit home. In Detroit, what emerged was a community that shared their hopes and vision for a city that they took great pride in. The community used the project to have a conversation that at times was very difficult and complex in nature. In the months leading up to the installation, initiatives emerged by local museums such as the MOCAD, who held haiku workshops to teach inner-city youth short-form poetry as a form of expression that could be submitted to the Memory Cloud. This and other initiatives enabled the community to become aware and participate in the project. Within the context of Detroit, art became a vehicle to bring together and discuss subject matter that could be very challenging. The statements offered were part of a collective diary that was being written by all there. Rest in peace, Jessica. Your body may have been left there, but your soul has risen above it. Detroit was my home, and I never feared it until now. I was born in the D, and I will die in the D, while enjoying every moment in between. Thank God for the D. Detroit surrounds us with its concrete love. They told me the city was dead. Instead, it brought me to life. On October 14th, 2006, for an hour, Adams Street and its slab of pavement became the happiest place on earth, and it was unforgettable. I thought I would move back to live among the dead memories of my childhood. I'm more alive than I've ever been. Each of these statements contributed to a collective narrative, and for 3 nights, a collective act of writing space was created. For those who may be interested, you can find an archive of the messages in addition to videos and images of the event on a site we created called voiceofdetroit.com. Beyond documentation and archiving, the site allows the conversation to continue. The project, as a public intervention, brought the community together and constructed a personal and collective voice to see the city anew. Memory Cloud of all our projects resonates in ways that explored issues that are very important to us about participation and enabling new forms of communication with the public. Most humbling to us was the conversation and the ideas that people brought to the work and the statements that they crafted. The power of this experience led the city and the art institutions to consider this as a model for future events, and based on our work, initiated a light biannual that is called De-Electricity that invited local and international artists to use the city as a canvas. The biennial has had 2 successful cycles and continues to grow, demonstrating the power of ideas to influence one's environment. We believe that art and design can actively participate in instigating change. The next project that I'm going to talk about is one called Becoming Animal. One aspect of the work that we've been developing through participatory models and enabling interfaces that has become a growing preoccupation for us revolves around systems that exhibit behaviors. We are very interested in the lifelike attributes that humans project onto things and the environments that evolve playful and curious interactions. Becoming Animal, developed in 2007, was one of our early attempts to explore this world of performance. Becoming Animal is an interactive performance piece that we initially developed for the experimental sonic performance festival, Faster Than Sound, that was curated by Joanna Seguro, and most recently was shown in Paola Antonelli's Talk to Me exhibition at the MOMA. It was one of our early experiments using emotive forms of interaction. The project explores the story of the mythical 3-headed beast Cerberus, guardian of the underworld. The objective of the piece was to create an environment of performance through collective participation. Each participant's presence stimulates the 3 heads of the Cerberus, triggering behavior-based interactions and exchanges. Interactions are expressed through sounds, facial expressions, and general activity of the Cerberus. The continued dialogue between users and the system demonstrates emotive exchanges that exhibit love, anger, and boredom. The system was developed to display lifelike responses so as to enable playful interactions between participants and the projection heads. I'll show a short film and talk over it. Becoming Animal used motion tracking to recognize participants through lights. The system would identify a number of participants through point light sources and identify and place their proximity in relation to the intensity of the light values, which would in turn be dynamically mapped. This simple recognition would develop dynamic and complex interactions. These interactions would include 3 distinct types of exchanges: the dog to user, dog to dog, and user to user. Beyond the passive models of observation found in traditional context of viewing art, the system would actively participate through dynamic patterns of stimuli. In responding to this, over 250 dog masks were created with embedded LED lights placed at the forehead of each mask. Obscuring recognition, the masks allowed participants to behave in an uninhibited manner, becoming performers in a theatrical system and exhibiting a collective playfulness.
I think building onto some of the things that we were exploring in projects like Becoming Animal, a project that sort of evolved from that were conversations about where interaction really lied and what were the actual stimulus for that. So in Becoming Animal, for example, we spent a lot of our time trying to develop something that was real time and trying to explore ideas of how to map things and so forth. But one of the things that became very obvious was that people generally are quite habitual. When they start to see things that are quite dynamic, they become quite passive. So in that project in particular, the mask became the real interface that allowed really these kind of playful and curious forms to evolve. But if the mask actually served a certain form of interaction in petting zoo, we were trying to develop something that wasn't contributed to the project, but was basically evolved as part of this kind of more behavioral environment. And like I alluded to before, a lot of these kind of cybernetic machines, in particular the stuff that Gordon Pask was doing as a conversation, as a form of interaction, were really important to us. And the project in many ways was really about sort of developing a strategy where we could have these kind of intimate and curious relationships between these three artificial robots, which we developed. We were developing for a couple of years, but actually were given the opportunity to show at the FRAC Centre as part of the Archilab, in a way actually to kind of explore certain aspects. The theme there was naturalizing architecture, but in a certain way, we were much more about trying to explore more animalistic and curious and playful ways. And in terms of the project, I think that was exploring, different forms of simulation to give a certain understanding about things, but I think the challenges that we found mostly was about rethinking this kind of digital and analog interplay and to develop kind of hardware that in a certain sense had the sensitivity to kind of give over to these kind of lifelike attributes that people actually project towards things. And I think this process, was very important because very much a part of the way that we work, and I think the part of the way that we teach is to think about making as a very fundamental way of thinking through problems. Design is for us very much a mode of inquiry, and to do design means that you sort of give yourself over to the project, and the project actually really dictates the response that is appropriate. So beyond kind of stylistic or other kind of attributes, the projects themselves have to really work and really be something that is fundamentally about the relationship between things. In Petting Zoo in particular, we try to build on some of that conversation between illumination and kinetics and sound as being the stimulus that we could sort of create a behavioral environment around. And I think for a lot of aspects of the becoming animal, the kinetics were things that actually started to tease and to sort of transform things through light and through sound. Things were amplified and communicated in different forms. And the sensitivity of actually using live experiments to be able to explore this so that it's not our projection on things was something that was very important to us. There was a limitation into how much we could do in terms of simulation and even in terms of the people that were working on the project, because their responses at some moment in time were trying to really decode or debug or to try to find a way to understand what was going on in the piece themselves. So we had a lot of our students that really tried to interact with a piece and took the opportunity whenever we could find a room to install it and to see what the actual responses actually were. Because for us, that was really the way to gauge and evaluate. It didn't matter if it worked, literally. It had to actually stimulate a kind of participation. And I think in a lot of things, we're always trying to figure out what's the appropriate way of working on the problem, and we make a lot of mistakes. These are just some of the basic interfacing that we had done over the last 4 years that led us from mobile phones, which was something that we knew a little bit about through projects like Memory Cloud, back into ideas of vision systems and cameras and moving towards Connect and other kinds of forms of detection. I think the thing that was important in terms of the FRAC was also, a certain belief that we had that people could interact with these things without having artificial boundaries around them. I think one of the things that was a sticking point in our conversations was if people should be allowed to walk through this, or if a barrier should be built around them so people wouldn't be hit by basically these robotic tentacles slapping kids and people around. But I think we were quite confident that people actually really have a much more curious and adaptive nature to things. And it ran for 6 months, and we didn't, thankfully, knock on wood, have any problems. Actually, what started to happen was a certain kind of intimacy around the piece that I think was really interesting for us, because as much as the relationship was between people and the piece itself, it was also exhibiting a kind of performance of other people within it. And we try to demystify everything by making everything kind of accessible. So from novelty, which may be the first kind of triggers to interact, to be able to sustain, to try to understand and ask questions about how it was working, to actually seeing all of the components and understanding in a more deeper way what was actually going on. We tried to make legible as much as we could the piece itself without instructions, but just really the stumbling in to an environment where you had two, let's call it dissimilar species, like Negroponte would talk about, meaningfully interact with each other. We had the opportunity of doing this over the summer at the Barbican, and we had a different kind of context for that. For us anyway, at the Barbican, we've had two opportunities, either to do it in the gallery in the same way that the FRAC was, or potentially to do it in this common space, which is the main kind of thoroughfare in the Barbican Centre. And we thought that we understood that environment quite well, but we thought we could deploy this in the everyday and to see what challenges that would actually afford. And in many ways, I think it offered a lot of complexity for us, but at the same time, we felt that it actually contributed something to this as an activator, as something that felt like it was very much part of the space. The exhibition itself around these kind of subjects of art and technology seemed to be quite popular. It was the most popular show that the Barbican's ever put on. It was interesting at the same time that there was a show that was being put forward on cybernetic serendipity at the ICA, which actually at the end of Memory Cloud, which we did, which was put on by the New Media department of the ICA. After us in October, there was Raffaello Lozano-Hemmer in November, and that department, which had a very long history of media art, was shut down. So I think it's very important to actually understand that a lot of this work that has been evolving from the 50s and 60s and 70s actually is just finding a home in some way now. And I think we're quite interested in trying to communicate, I think, also this kind of evolution of some of these ideas. The Barbican was an interesting opportunity for us because it was in such a public place to see how these things would actually really learn or evolve between their interactions with each other. And I think this project, anyway, has had a life of its own, and it's doing its own thing. It's in Stockholm at the moment, and then it's going to Athens, which is interesting that some of these projects actually seem to travel more than you do. But most recently, as of last weekend, we had the opportunity to respond to a particular brief set up by Nesta for something that they were calling Future Fest. And with Stephen and with my colleagues like Mustafa and others, we developed a project which was trying to build on the aspects of this sort of emotive response, but actually reconsider maybe some of those challenges that David had originally given to me when we had to revisit this idea of what the living pod or living pod tower could be. So Nesta was asking about the future of democracy, future of machines, money, music, thrills. And they had characters like Edward Snowden and George Clinton, Vivienne Westwood. And we were offered an opportunity as a commission to develop a piece that was supposed to talk about the future of machine. Our conversation about the future of machine, we felt it was really important to really put on the table that our living environments are very important to kind of explore within that context. A lot of people were talking about the immaterial and the ephemeral, but at some moment in time, when we consider the role of machines, we should consider the role of us and them cohabiting in a kind of ecology, which is much more understood. And what we tried to explore was what it would be like to have a kind of self-organizing city that was predicated on every individual's kind of behavioral response. And it built on certain attitudes that I guess for us we've been developing, and we had called adaptive ecologies, of exploring different kinds of systems that interact with other systems and develop a kind of strategy which was polyscalar and actually evolving over time. And a lot of the clues that we got in terms of models for this form of interaction were very much animalistic and very much at home with social insects and other kinds of models. So termites and stigmergy, ant colonies, different kinds of strategies of living that were collective, shared, and developing ecologies between different kinds of interacting agents. When they talked about the future, particularly with a concept that they were trying to articulate with all of these different characters that they've invited, we very much thought about Marshall McLuhan quote that we use quite a lot in the conversations, particularly of me and Stephen, which he basically stated, and I'm paraphrasing this, if you're interested in the future, look towards the present because we live in the past. And when I start, I think, really to articulate some of these aspects and we start to look at some of the ideas people had, and this is a cover of 1913 Scientific America, you start to see that the city was really this three-dimensional, mobile, infrastructure, architectural, integrated system. When we start to look at basically how we see the city today, this was an image rendition that the TfL commissioned about what the future of London will be in 2026, where the future of London basically is geared towards entertainment, it seems. The city is very familiar, but we have different kinds of wheels, some horizontal, some roller coasters. And if it's not this kind of idea, which is slightly more optimistic, we get usually this, which is this idea that everything should be the same, generic, boring, but actually understood. And when we revisit, I think, some of those seminal projects from the 60s and 70s, they're usually disregarded as utopian because they had a vision. And we never felt that the vision was a problem. It was the issue of latency and uncertainty, developing adaptive models that would allow that to kind of evolve with the challenges of the time. So at least from our attitude, even if we've done master plans in our own design work, we thought in terms of Future Fest, which was a project that we did over 4 weeks, that we would rediscover, I think, some of those aspects of mobility within the city and the living, and sort of reconsider maybe some of those seminal projects like Broadacre City that were also trying to push a certain attitude towards living, but with the well-defined aspect that mobility and these machines, like these flying copters and stuff like that, would very much be a part of that. And so I don't have any kind of grand scheme conversations about it, but we tried to build a machine in itself, which was symbolic of every individual's idea of living environments would actually start to create a strategy for how these things would meaningfully interact. So we speculated that every living environment, if it was given its own ability to interact with other living environments, very much how we socially engage within the city, and we allowed that to run its process through, we could develop a model for self-organization built from a community building and a neighborhood building sort of protocol, and sort of developed a kind of model that would allow, at least in some form, a suggestion of potentially what that kind of model of understanding would be. So this isn't a proposal in a fixed and finite form. This was using illumination, almost like a Nicholas Schofer experiment, to animate the strategy and to sort of give witness to the idea that we live in a sort of time where we say that the urban or the city is the answer in some form. And there's an acknowledgement that cities are really life systems in a much deeper ecology than sometimes we really give credit to. But we sort of treat that in a way where we master plan it and we try to blueprint it. And what we were suggesting is that these are sort of failed models and trying to articulate at least the opportunity to rethink what the mobile city would be. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank the kids that were kind of helping us out on that, and sort of finish with a quote that Wolf Prix kind of gave in a lecture last year, which I thought was really appropriate for Future Fest, which was a 2-day event, and probably just as appropriate in this lecture, where in just 2 days, tomorrow will be yesterday. So with that, we thank you for your patience, and if you have any questions, happy to answer. Everything was super crystal clear. Well, that's pretty good, actually. I doubt that, though.
Thank you for the lecture. I just wonder if you want to develop the petting zoo, how the future development of that project will be. Do you thinking of enlarging the scale, or how it's going to be in your idea? Thank you.
Yeah, I think what we found with petting zoo was that we felt that there were, I think, a lot of curious and playful interactions that became very personal with people. And I think one of the things that we're trying to explore is to try to make that more embedded in the everyday. Instead of by chance coming across, let's say, a robot in whatever form it is to have something that's much more embedded within the everyday environment and the things and behaviors that people have. So I guess at least in terms of the sketch that we put out for the Emotive City project, it was an understanding that if architecture could somehow, in a sense, be driven, articulated, organized around human interaction, what form would that take? Without fixed form being an objective, it was something that was considered as something that was continually reforming. So I think in many ways, I think we're just starting to kind of articulate some of that stuff. I mean, for us, participation is really important. And we've had a strong connection to, let's say, people creating that intimacy and using a lot of our work to communicate through. And I think as we develop that kind of body of work, we're trying to think of models that can be embedded in much more everyday environments and try to use space as really that opportunity where if Memory Cloud gave us that opportunity to use a public space and a civic space and to reconsider it, I think the challenges of living, and particularly within the domestic environment, is something that we're interested in exploring.
Not a very inquisitive audience.
I'm sure they got questions. Maybe they're a little shy. Please.
Oh my God, okay. You said architecture is space. And I see these as objects interacting with people within the space. How do you see them translating within the built form around us? Is this something you would like to look into further?
Yeah, I think that's a cue from David, the built stuff.
No, I've often wondered, I was wondering the other day, I'm sorry.
No.
Whether they're real or not.
They're fake. I mean, to be honest with you, we think like projects like Memory Cloud have been like the most radical in our thinking because it completely dematerialized things. Just light and atmosphere was enough to create space. But I think in some ways, we feel that there are also some very pressing challenges. So we're talking about living, and particularly about thinking through about some of these problems, because we feel that architecture has some problems to cope when it's treated in a very fixed and finite way. So over the weekend, when we were proposing this self-organizing city, a lot of people, general everyday public and some very specialist researchers asked us, well, you know, what could this be good for? And particularly to the research that some of our students do, some of your colleagues. And I think the objective should be to think about the opportunities and the potential within that. So examples like post-disaster, where infrastructure isn't a given, is a world where robotic architecture and autonomous systems could potentially offer something. I think we had a lot of people asking us if we were worried about basically the machines taking over. And I don't think we really worry about that kind of stuff. But I think it's important to actually think that this is also mediums of architecture. So for us anyway, a lot of the projects, and particularly about space, is to think of space as an interface and to think about the things themselves as actually having the opportunity to sense and also to observe things so that we can have meaningful conversations with them as we do with each other, and in some way develop an attitude towards space as an ecology so that in one way or another we celebrate diversity and the interaction between things instead of the things themselves.
Do you, sorry, I enjoyed that very much, but do you see yourself as pushing or being pulled? Do you see yourself as making incursions, interventions, ideas into an architectural space? Or do you see an architecture out there that's calling in pain, crying out for solutions and new ideas into which you are trying to present your contribution?
Yeah, I basically want architecture to participate. Like in the most meaningful sense, I think the conversations, particularly with Stephen, have always been about trying to make things more humanly centric. We feel that people actually want more and deserve more. And I think sometimes the architecture that we consider today is out of habit and isn't necessarily challenging with any conviction some of the things that we're more capable of doing. So I think a lot of the work that we're doing in some way is for us to build a better understanding and to make things accessible. So one of the, let's say, desires that we have in a lot of the work is to make it more shared and collective. But part of that is also not taking a position where we actually have the answer, but try to make a model or a framework where we allow people to make more informed questions. Because I think at some moment, I feel like we're at kind of a tipping point where we feel that there's a lot of burden of everything around us, but also as much information that we have an inability to sort of respond. But I feel collectively, and I feel much more that's the case when I see the education around how my students are also thinking about things, how we discuss with other colleagues. I think that there's an opportunity to think about architecture in a much more diverse and much more progressive manner. And part of that is enabling that architecture itself to find its own form of communication and to facilitate its own being. Not something that we create, but something that is actually evolved through interaction. So for us, those models like Pask and yourself, John, that we're talking about, particularly through conversation and curiosity and play, we feel are meaningful things that are very important to think about because they're very human. In some way, they sort of enable people to also engage ways that make them understand that they have an influence and a role to play. Is that an answer? Sort of.
Seeing yourself, you're seeing yourself as some kind of some sort of intermediary, interceding between these two realms.
Yeah, I think particularly in the work that we've done with Stephen, that it's important to construct frameworks to allow other people to define. And we feel that that definition should be something that's collective. We're just kids from Jersey, John.
Hi there. This is just a follow-up question on your diversity, architecture becoming more diverse. I'm actually...
Sorry, you're right in front of me. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm doing a European project called CREAM, which is looking at all the creative industries and the creative technologies and bridging the two, so recommending certain technologies for certain sectors. And I'm in charge of architecture, and it strikes me that architecture is, especially in this country, one of the most conservative of the creative arts because of the heavy regulations and the expense of architecture. So how do you see that big problem with policy and regulation being overcome if we're going to become more diverse?
Yeah, I think there is a real issue today with over-regulating and exhibiting a form of control which at some moment is kind of dominating and killing off any form of creative response. And I think particularly in our own thinking about things, control is an illusion. So we feel like it's very important to try to find models that are, I'm not going to use the word experimental, but at least are trying to identify really what are the given problems. So for example, architecture at the moment is something that has to redefine itself, because we may be talking about the built environment, but that may not necessitate a definition of what architecture really's value or contribution is today. So I think we try to meaningfully talk about things that are interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but not because we feel that it's in itself, by itself, important, it's just necessary. So we always use models like the Macy conferences because we felt like those were opportunities where really the brightest came together, regardless of their difficulties or disciplines, to talk about ecology, environments, to talk about new materials, and to talk about the psychology of spaces, the social forms of interaction, and we feel like it's an important talking point. We participated in Future Fest, and I believe we met when you were there. And our contribution was purposefully just to put architecture at least in the conversation, because we feel like it's not even being discussed. Neither is really infrastructure, and neither is generally urbanism. We usually have very simplistic models of actually talking about the most complex life systems. So we feel as long as we can really engage and be part of those conversations, we can sort of have an influence in a meaningful one to sort of evolve that conversation in a way that actually gets enacted in the city. London, for many reasons, is prototyping and piloting a lot of projects. So some of the autonomous cars are being piloted by Arabs right now, and there are sort of mandates, let's say, to think about living on the water, using Thames as a new territory because of flooding concerns. But the people that are actually really working on those projects are not necessarily the people that should. And I think maybe part of the objective is to actually think about really the creative partnerships that could happen, and also to celebrate youth and the people that are actually coming to London to explore some of these ideas, and to change legislation by demonstrating that there are alternative models. So we actively try to do prototypes with our students and in our own work, because at least they are suggestive of things and they become really important talking points. And you know, it's good to hear that you're looking at architecture, because someone should.
Thank you very much.
Any last conversations, or are you guys gonna go back to your essays and all of the other stuff that you guys gotta do? Everything cool?
Hi.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much.